The sound of praise for your Sunday morning.
The only one who could ever teach me
Introducing Reverend A.R. Bernard of the Christian Cultural Center
was the son of a preacher man.
and Rabbi Joseph Potasnik of Religion on the Line.
The only one who could ever teach me.
Now, here's the Rev and the Rabbi, where faith matters.
Good morning, I'm Rabbi Joseph Potasnik.
And I'm Reverend A.R. Bernard.
We want to wish everyone who's celebrating Easter today, the Eastern Orthodox time of the year, a very, very healthy, happy Easter. So that's a whole issue with the calendar. Trying to get everybody on the same calendar, but of course there are traditions that remain sacred, and just want to bring to your attention.
Yeah, this is true. Easter.
Elias, do you have music to introduce our guest?
Uh-oh.
All
now
right.
we're being creative here. I love it.
All right. That music means one thing. It's Alan Abramson, criminal defense attorney of the firm of Abramson and Morak. Good morning, Alan. Nice to have you with us.
Good morning, Rabbi. Good morning, Reverend. How are you?
Yeah, I'm well. That music just, stirred a question in me, but I don't know where Rabbi wants to start the conversation.
Well,
I'm curious about I'm curious about the tension between law and order.
Well, you know what's interesting, Rev? I was telling Alan off the air. We just concluded Passover, which is followed weeks later by Pentecost, Shavuot, and that's all about law. So freedom without law is not what it should be. You need freedom and law. So we're going to talk about First Amendment. We're going to talk about buffer zones. So, Alan, why don't you explain First Amendment to us, what it is, what it isn't?
Well, the First Amendment protects our freedom of speech, assembly, worship, but there's always a tension with the First Amendment. And in this case, what you have is your freedom to exercise your religion and pray in safety versus the right of people to express themselves and disagree and protest near houses of worship. And it's not an either or situation. We have to provide safety for the people that are going to a house of worship, and we have to provide safety and a forum for the people that want to express their views, which may be very divergent from people that are using the house of worship. So it's a balance.
I want to ask you a question because everyone's the Constitution's collapsing and all of that. But in reality, there's fiction, there's reality. At the level of law, freedom of speech in the United States still remains exceptionally robust. Isn't that true? I mean, we shouldn't be afraid of the collapse of freedom of speech or the Constitution on this matter, are we?
No, I wouldn't be afraid of the loss of your ability to speak freely and protest, but it is under somewhat of an attack. And I think that just forces all of us to be ever more vigilant in protecting the freedom of speech and recognizing that sometimes it's not always neat. You hear things that you don't want to hear. You see things that you don't want to see. But people have the right to express themselves freely in this country. And there are compromises that have to be made, but we always have to keep our eye on the prize here, which would be a country where people can argue and debate and protest and say what they want, because ultimately that leads us to a better conclusion in how we handle our affairs.
You mentioned something about no right of protest inside a house of worship.
Yes, that's correct. I want to be very clear about that because people have the right to protest outside of a house of worship, and there may be some restrictions to that. There may be time, place, and manner regulations. But the First Amendment doesn't apply inside a house of worship. A house of worship is a private facility, and the First Amendment protects us from government restriction of speech, not private restriction of speech. So a congregation of any sort can say, no, you cannot protest in here. You get arrested if you protest inside a house of worship without the permission of the congregation.
So let me ask you a question. You brought it into the house of worship. Does the clergy have full freedom if it's consistent with their religious tradition to reject other people or to speak ill or defame other people. Is that okay? That's allowed?
Well, defaming other people is not allowed. Defamation is an exception to the First Amendment. You're not allowed to engage in speech that will defame other people. And that's always been an exception to the First Amendment. But other than that, I mean, you have the right to limit whoever you want to come into the church or synagogue or mosque. Mm-hmm. You can make those choices. That is your right to freedom of assembly and association, and nobody has the right to come into the house of worship without the permission of the pastor or rabbi or congregation.
You know, to emphasize that freedom of speech, you may find that in some congregations, in the naming of the synagogue, for example, it says the Free Synagogue of Flushing or the Stephen Y. Free Synagogue. And the reason for the word free was to say that the pulpit was free. The rabbi could preach a sermon without imposition, without interference by others. That's how much they valued free speech, that even in the name itself, it was emphasized.
Mm-hmm.
That's a wonderful principle. I have to be candid, Rabbi. I did not know that, but that is marvelous.
Well, I do it for the Rev's sake. Now you're free.
I appreciate that.
Rev, to say what you want.
So, what about even offensive or extremist speech? Is that protected, even if it's likely to produce immediate violence?
Well, no. There are restrictions. There are some restrictions, and there are, again, time, place, and manner restrictions. Fighting words are not protected, but there's a difference between fighting words and words that you find offensive. Offensive things can be protected, but if your speech turns into something that poses an immediate danger, that speech can be limited, and it's always been true. That has always been true. There's no absolute right to your freedom of speech. There are many times when there can be reasonable restrictions that are placed on the freedom of speech, but they have to leave the person's right to speak freely robust.
So, Alan, let me ask, those who oppose, for example, a buffer zone, those who feel they have the right to protest, does that mean they feel they can protest in your face as you're walking into a house of worship? They don't accept the fact there should be a separation?
No, I don't think that's correct. But let me, the law that the city council recently passed that will allow the police department to set up buffer zones, that's going to be appealed once it passes by the New York Civil Liberties Union. And their approach is somewhat different than what you just said. They believe that there are currently laws on the books that prevent interference with religious worship. There are two different laws. There's a law that talks specifically about interference with religious worship. It's a misdemeanor. It talks about using force or threats or coercion to prohibit people or to interfere with someone exercising their religious freedom at a place of worship. And then there is a law about the disruption of religious services. That's prohibited also. So, and if you have a record of doing this, it becomes a felony. So there are laws on the books that deal with these issues, and the Civil Liberties Union is going to appeal this based on primarily that concept. You don't have the right to stand in front of somebody or hit them. You have to allow them access, but you have to be able to get your message across.
We're coming close to a break, but when we come back, I'd love to understand the technological reality when it comes to this now, because there's a major shift in free speech when it comes to digital platforms that are supposedly private, like Meta, Facebook, Instagram, X, Google, YouTube. These are private companies, and how does this apply to utilizing those platforms and saying whatever you want?
Alan, I see that we speak of the stairway to heaven and a highway to hell, which shows you where the congestion is. where it's going, which means people do need attorneys. They need criminal defense attorneys a number of times. Rev, I know you had a question that I want to follow up on.
Yeah. I just want to get back to private companies. These digital platforms like Facebook and Instagram and X and Google and YouTube. Does the First Amendment apply to them in the same way, or is it different standard?
Look, I think the overriding principle is that the First Amendment prohibits government interference with your free speech rights. Government interference, not private interference. And if it's solely a private company, then they can determine who has access to their platform, and they can discriminate based on what the message is of the speaker. But that's my position, that the only thing that is prohibited by the First Amendment is when government interferes, not private people, not private.
That's important. Yeah, that's a very important clarification, because people use it as a blanket statement, but there are situations where the same standard is not applicable, because now we're talking about, well, who decides what speech is acceptable and what isn't acceptable, and
right, but so many times, Reverend, you hear people say, "Don't I have a First Amendment right?" I mean, a kid says that to his parents. "I have a First Amendment right." No, you don't. not in your house, not with your parents. You only have a First Amendment right to speak without the government telling you what you can and can't say.
That's why people have been thrown off, Meta or whatever other platforms, because they've exceeded certain standards that the company has raised.
That's right.
Let me ask you this. Suppose that you got a hybrid here. It's a private institution, a university, for example, receiving money from the government for research. How does that in any way impact the right to limit free speech if you're private but getting public money?
Yes, it does. It does. I'm sorry I jumped in like that, but that's a pretty clear principle. If a school or an institution is completely privately funded, they can discriminate against viewpoint, message, whatever they'd like. But if you are taking federal money, then that opens up the door to the federal government coming in and taking positions if you're going to be limiting the rights of people to speak freely on the campus.
Interesting. So,
go ahead. Go ahead, Rabbi.
So, go back to the house of worship. It's not just about prayer. It's if you have a program in the house of worship that people don't like, right? Does that change anything? No. I mean, it's part of the work of the house of worship. Mm-hmm. And if they have a program, I mean, look, people may come out to protest the program. They may disagree, not violently, but something just short of that. And that's really what we see quite often here in New York City. People don't like the subject matter of a program. They're going to come out and protest. The question is, can they disrupt the program inside the house of worship? No, they can't. Can they protest loudly? And if the level of their protest makes it difficult to hear inside the house of worship, that may require them to move a little bit further back from the outside or maybe across the street. But it has to be a reasonable restriction that you place. And it doesn't mean that they have to be silent. They can be as loud as they want in most cases, but they cannot behave in a way that completely drowns out the ability of the people inside the house of worship to exercise programs, religion, prayers, whatever they would like inside the house.
Wow. It's interesting because we're redefining so many things today, and we use that as a blanket term. Well, I have free speech, but there's consequence, and especially in cancel culture. You will be canceled in a minute if people disagree with what you have to say. But I'm more concerned about clergy, from the pulpit, espousing certain doctrines, whether it's anti-Semitism or racism or anything like that. How does the government respond to that? Or, are they allowed to, given free speech?
Reverend, this is difficult difficult topic because the reality is that people have the right to be racist and espouse racist doctrine and anti-Semitic doctrine. The best example is the Ku Klux Klan marching in Skokie. Mm-hmm. Not only did they have the right to march in Skokie, but the town, Skokie, had the obligation to keep them safe. So if it takes 250 police officers from Illinois to walk with 15 Ku Klux Klan members down the street in order to protect them from being injured, that's the obligation of the town. And by the way, the Ku Klux Klan doesn't have to pay for the services that they get. No. That's just part of the government's obligation to protect free speech.
One of the things, Alan, that I believe you've mentioned in a previous interview is that the best way to combat speech or hate speech is with your exercise of your free speech rights.
That's right.
When people talk about, what the others said, but the question is, well, what did you say to combat it? Right.
To me, more speech, the better. There may be speech that I disagree with, and it is hurtful, and it has consequences. But to me, the only response to that is to have more speech. If someone takes a position that you think is racist or anti-Semitic, you have the right to correct them, to disagree, to argue, to yell, all of those things. You have the right to educate people as to what you think the proper position is. But it's as I said before, the First Amendment is messy because we all want our First Amendment rights, except if that person's rights disagree with what you think. And that's not the way it works.
And does it have to be true? I mean, can I say things that are not true? And I know they're not true, but, I want to influence the public in a certain direction concerning a particular movement, ideology, or person, or faith or race. I have the freedom to say things that are not true. Is that correct?
Yes, you do. You have the right to say things that are not true. You don't have the right to defame someone, as what we were saying before. But you don't have to be accurate in your speech, and you can exaggerate in your speech, and you can use hyperbole. Mm-hmm. And that is protected speech, unless it crosses a certain line to either be defamatory, slanderous, or fighting words. You have the right to be wrong.
Right. Alan Abramson, always a pleasure to have you on the air. You and I go back many years, Alan.
Yes, we do.
Yeah,
yes, we do.
It's always been an honor.
It's always, I can't tell you what an honor it is for me to be able to come on the show and to talk about these topics. And it's so important that we have these discussions and people weigh in on these discussions. That's what we need.
Yeah.
More talk like that.
Yeah. Well, in keeping with your tradition, Alan, we do this for you pro bono. All right.
And you're the first one, Alan, that received a musical introduction in the history of the show.
Go.
I just want you to know.
I don't have to pay for the rights of that, do I? I mean,
well,
I'm going to leave that with Rabbi.
No. If we do, we're calling an Alan Abramson.
There you go.
Another pro bono case for you.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Alan Abramson. Stay tuned for more of the Rev and the Rabbi this Sunday morning right here on Red Apple Radio Network.